What's up, everybody? Jeff here, and happy Gen Con. There's been a ton of really interesting stuff going on in the wargaming industry recently, and with Gen Con coming this week, this is the time of year where we're probably going to get a whole bunch of news about more new stuff that's coming. So all this stuff got me thinking about the types of things that I would like to see come to some of my favorite games. So this is going to be a list of the top 5 things that I would like to see Wyrd Miniatures do. Now, this is going to be a mix of new products and policy changes and practices that I would like to see them implement. But before we get into it, let's do something kind of fun. Before you watch the rest of this video, I want you to post a comment below and list a couple of the things that you would like to see Wyrd do. And then at the end of the video, we can see if any of yours were the same as mine. But don't cheat and watch the video first and then post the comment. That's not cool. Alright, so the first thing on my wish list for Wyrd is something a little bit different. I recently went through and tried to make a list of all of the Miss models and the Nightmare boxes that Wyrd has ever put out. And I found that information was surprisingly hard to come by, and there was a few that I actually forgot about and didn't actually put on the list until a couple folks reminded me on the Discord. And this actually highlights for me one of the issues that I've heard communicated from new players or people that want to get into the game, which is that discoverability of the miniatures is actually a little bit difficult. It can be hard to find pictures of the models, to know which models go in which crews, and even just identifying models that people might have or find on an eBay sale can be a little bit tricky if you don't know what you're looking for. This is actually one of the reasons that I recently started a series called Rule of Cool, where I go through each of the crews, give some of their background, and show off the miniatures. It's kind of like a little commercial for any new players that might want to get a sense of the look and feel of the different crews, but have a hard time just Googling pictures and names because they don't really know what to look for. So what I would like to see Wyrd do is put out a comprehensive list of every model that they've ever released. Now, I know that's probably a daunting task for the folks at Wyrd because they've put out a ton of models, but having a way to reference the different editions and the different versions and special editions of models that have been released would be really helpful and really cool. Now, I get there's probably not a lot of incentive for Wyrd to do things like this because a lot of those models have been out of print for years and are not available anymore, certainly not directly from Wyrd. But they do still have a lot of their old stuff up on their website, and I think it would be a really great resource both for collectors and for folks who have a bunch of old models and don't really know what they are. Plus, it's a great way to catalog all the work that they've done over the years. One of the things that I like to do on this channel is to highlight a lot of that old lore that isn't really around anymore and people don't pay much attention to make sure that people don't forget it. Because some of those stories are really excellent and I think people will still enjoy them. But the same thing is true for the models. If you haven't been playing Malifaux for very long, then you should definitely go spend some time on Google and just look at some of the first edition stuff because the art and the design of the models is super unique. It's very strange. It's very weird, you might say. But it's also very different from the types of things that you see if you just got in 3rd edition or even in 2nd edition. But you'll probably also find that you have a hard time finding some of the stuff. So that's why I'd like to see Wyrd put together that database. And maybe they can even put in some of the old art that they've taken down off their website and isn't available anymore. But that'd just be a bonus. So you had to know when you clicked on this video that we were going to talk about the lore, because it's kind of what I do. And for anybody who doesn't know, years ago, Wyrd used to put out a thing called Wyrd Chronicles, which was a quarterly-ish magazine that had all sorts of stuff in it. It had interviews with designers and developers, it had hobby tips, it had lore, it had Through the Breach one-shot pre-written adventures. It was really cool. And a couple years back, they actually discontinued Wyrd Chronicles. Now, understandably, it probably took a lot of work to put that stuff together, and Wyrd is a small team. But it kind of left a little gap in the way that some of the lore gets put out from Malifaux. Some of the stories from Chronicles were actually super important major world events, like when Nicodem gets killed. But the vast majority of them were these little slice of life stories where we just get a little small self-contained story about a character that we never hear from again and some horrible things that happened to them in Malifaux. They did a really good job of building the world and giving you a better sense of the types of things that you might go through if you lived in Malifaux. And a lot of them really set the tone in an interesting way for the game. Plus, it was a great way in some cases to catch up with characters who weren't part of the A plot or even the B plot, and keep up a little bit with what they've been doing while they've been off-screen not doing anything important. You may have noticed that since 3rd editions came out, we've gotten a lot more lore in the main books, because at the beginning of 3rd edition, every faction got their own book with 3 to 4 stories in it. Now that was super awesome, but there was a handful of characters that got left out of that. Some characters who we haven't seen in a while weren't featured in any of those stories, and some of the newer characters were introduced and just never got a story, like Nexus or Anya. So Wyrd Chronicles would have been an interesting way to put out some lore for some of those characters. Not to mention the Clampets, because I know all of you Bayou fans out there are very upset about the Clampets. They technically don't even get a real mention in the lore. But since those faction books got put out, we've gotten Malifaux Burns and Madness of Malifaux, which were mostly just one big story in each book. Now, those stories were really excellent, but they really only featured a core cast of characters who made any kind of significant appearances in the story. Which doesn't really leave an opportunity to tell much of a story about some of the side characters or the people that aren't major players in the overall plot. Now, interestingly, when Wyrd Chronicles was canceled, they actually mentioned that they were going to start occasionally putting out some stories on Waldo's Weekly. And we've seen a little bit of that early on, but for the most part, that never really came to be. So the second thing on my wish list for Wyrd is to start putting out some sort of regular lore releases in smaller form that's more frequent than the major books. They don't necessarily have to revive Wyrd Chronicles, but it could be part of Worldless Weekly, it could be a separate article on the site. There's a bunch of different ways that I think they could do it that would be really interesting, and it's something that I would really love to see. I know a whole bunch of other people out there who are big fans of the lore would also love to see some stuff like this. And I also know it would be a ton of work on Wyrd's part, but I think that they could do it if they really wanted to. Just give me more lore, I'm begging you. Honestly, we're kind of spoiled because the RPG books have so much content in them, and we've gotten more stories in 3rd edition than ever before, but I still want more. Hey, if you're enjoying this video so far, then don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Those things actually really help push the video out in the algorithm and get other people watching these things on YouTube. You can also check the link for the Discord in the description where you can come over and hang out with me in the community and chat about these types of things. And if you want to support the channel more directly, then you can consider supporting the Patreon or buying merch from the merch store, also linked below. But most importantly, with the Wyrd sale going on right now, there's an affiliate link in the description. You can click on that link, and when you make any purchases on Wyrd's web store during the sale, or anytime after that, it will actually go to support me and the channel. So I really appreciate that, but now let's get back to the video. Alright, so this is one that I know is going to get a lot of people riled up, but we're going to do it anyway. Dead Man's Hand. Now before I say more, I have gone on record as being in favor of Dead Man's Hand in the past, and I stand by that. I think that Dead Man's Hand is an interesting way to add stakes to the story, and I think that it's really important that the plot actually changes and advances over time, instead of just staying stagnant and nothing ever happening. I also think it's potentially an interesting way to mix up the meta, but we'll kind of get back to that in a minute. So for anybody who's not caught up, in the transition from 2nd edition Malifaux to 3rd edition Malifaux, a handful of characters went the way of the dodo. They got put into this thing called Dead Man's Hand, which basically means that they are eliminated from the story for various reasons, and they're not going to be supported going forward, but they have rules and you can technically play them, but not really in a tournament unless you have special permission. Spoilers, most people don't allow them in tournaments. Now, when this was originally announced, it was talked about like it was going to be something where characters rotate in and out frequently. So something like seasons that you might see in other games. And the idea was that some of these characters weren't balanced or were stale, so they would be removed from the meta temporarily, and then they would come back into the competitive rotation. Now, I don't know what fast means to you, but since 3rd edition has been out, we got a couple of characters that went to Dead Man's Hand, and nothing's changed about it ever since. Now, I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, because if you rotate things in and out too quickly, it can kind of flip the game on its head regularly, and it can be very confusing and hard to keep up with. I think there's a delicate balance between keeping things the same and making sure that it doesn't get stale. But I think that the problem with Dead Man's Hand is the lack of real understanding about what to expect. So the third thing I would like to see from Wyrd is some sort of official policy about what Dead Man's Hand is going to look like moving forward. Now, I've always said that I think a lot of the characters that went into Dead Man's Hand will come back even in the story, because every one of them, with the exception of Ryle, has a clear path for them to return to some sort of relevance in the story, whether that be coming back from the dead, or breaking out of jail, or coming back out of her tomb. Some of those things I think are more likely than others, but that's kind of beside the point. It would be really cool to see Lilith come back and beat up her sister and take over the Neverborn again. I think most of the community can get behind that, because Lilith's way cooler than Nikema. But what I want to know is, should we be expecting more characters to go into Dead Man's Hand? Are we going to kill off more characters? And if so, is this going to be any kind of regular thing, or is it going to be once an edition? Because I think if it's once an edition, it sort of defeats the purpose that it was originally sort of pitched as a way to balance the meta and keep it from getting stale. And it ends up more being just a reflection of the lore and the story and where we're at in the world. Which I think is fine. That actually is a little bit more interesting to me than just randomly cycling in and out and not having any implications to the lore. But I think I just want to hear it officially from Wyrd of what they plan to do with it. They don't necessarily have to spoil anything, but just an idea of what we can expect in the future would be really good. Now, I have a little list here of characters who I think are not going to make it into 4th edition, but I'm going to keep that a secret for now. And maybe we'll talk a little bit more about that if we ever get an official announcement about 4th edition or Dead Man's Hand in general. Oh, and please don't kill off Marcus. I'll be really sad. Alright, so back to lore things. One of the most consistent pieces of feedback that I get from the community is that they find it a little bit difficult to get a hold of Malifaux lore. Now, from an objective perspective, that is a little bit silly, because the Breachside broadcast is something that you do not see any other companies doing for their lore. You can literally get all of Malifaux lore, or the vast majority of Malifaux lore, for free in audiobook form with really cool production values and the whole 9 yards. Really awesome. Check it out if you've never watched it before. But I do think it's a valid position for people who are like me, who actually prefer to read the books as opposed to listen to the audiobooks. If you were brand new to Malifaux today, you would have to go collect 3 editions worth of books, which is like something like 20 books at this point, to get caught up on all the lore. And most of those books are out of print. Now, you can get them digitally, which, again, Wyrd's lore is actually easier to get than most other companies, but I digress. The fourth thing that I would like to see Wyrd do is to put out a compendium of all of the lore. I'm talking about a big, hardcover, coffee table style book that has beautiful art and every story from first edition on through to maybe just through the end of second edition, maybe one book per edition. I don't know. I think there's a lot of different ways that you could do it, but I think it would be a really cool piece for collectors and lore buffs and for people who want to get caught up on all the lore but don't want to go try to hunt down first edition books. This would also be a really cool way to give credit to the authors who wrote the stories from first and the beginning of second edition, because originally they weren't actually credited in the stories, they were just credited at the beginning of the book. And I'm really glad that they changed that, because it's interesting to know who wrote what stories. But it can actually be hard to track some of that information down unless you go and actually speak to the authors. I'm really not sure how the economics of something like this would work, because I know it's a pretty niche product, and it would probably only be a small part of the community that would be interested in this. But it is something that I've heard other people bring up. This is actually not originally my idea. I've heard people talk about it on Discord and Reddit before. So I know there's at least some appetite for something like this. Other companies have put out art books in the past, and they seem to do pretty well, especially on places like Kickstarter. And while that would be something that would be awesome to see Wyrd do, I would be more interested in seeing them do it with the lore, or maybe both. A guy can dream. Alright, so this one here is, I think, both the most realistic thing that we can expect on this list, and it's the thing I will be absolutely the most excited about. So what's a couple of things that we know about Wyrd and Malifaux? It's got some of the best lore of any wargame that I know of, and the company really appreciates the lore and seems to always want to do right by that lore. Easily, uncontested, the best mechanics of any wargame. I named my channel Defective Dice because dice rolling is bad and card flipping is way better. We also know that they have gorgeous models, and we know that they can do a great job of making terrain and other accessories for games, because we've seen some of the board games that they've put out, and the Wyrdscapes terrain line, which is really awesome. Now, I love playing Malifaux. It's a really good competitive game, and it's a lot of fun to kind of test your skills against another player. But one of the things that I find really interesting in this hobby is cooperative games. So the fifth and final thing on my wish list for Wyrd is for them to put out a co-op dungeon crawl in the Malifaux universe. Now, we know they have the design chops for it because Vagrant Song is pretty close to what I'm talking about here. We know that they would do an incredible job of it for all the aforementioned reasons. And we know that there's a market for this because games like Dungeon Saga and Gloomhaven are super popular, and even Corvus Belli put out Infinity Defiance a few years back, which is literally a miniature war game that was turned into a co-op dungeon crawler. Now, I love Infinity Defiance. I plan on doing some videos about that pretty soon. That game is a ton of fun. It's great to get a group of people together and play games in that world without having to sit down and have the sort of tense stress of playing an actual war game. It's a little more casual, and it's a little bit more narrative focused, which is why I think it would be perfect for Malifaux. We could have 4 adventurers that are creeping through the bayou and get caught up in some sort of gremlin shenanigans. We could have a group of treasure hunters who are searching through the necropolis and find all sorts of arcane artifacts and magical items. Or it could take place in the Knotwoods, where a bunch of people are lost in the forest and trying to escape and get away from Titania and her minions. There's so much potential for a game like that, and if Wyrd hasn't at least started thinking about this yet, then they're crazy. Personally, something like that would be more exciting to me than almost anything else that I can think of that they could announce in the next year or two. More exciting than a new edition of Malifaux, more exciting than the reboot and the new factions for the other side, more exciting than the other 4 things that I've already mentioned on this list. Yeah, I think it would be the most exciting thing that could happen, at least for me. Alright, so that's it for my wish list from Wyrd. So now let's take a look. Were any of your picks the same as anything that I put on my list? And whether they were or not, what did you think of the things that I listed out? Would any of those things be particularly exciting for you? Or do you think you have some better ideas that supersede some of mine? Make sure you get into the comments below and we can have a little popularity contest to see who has the best ideas. Who knows, maybe some of the folks from Wyrd will actually check out the comments and pick up some of the ideas that we're all talking about. But anyway, I hope you're excited for Gen Con, and I hope you're excited for all the cool stuff that Wyrd's going to be doing in the future, whether it's the things that I asked for or some new surprises that we never even anticipated. If you're watching this soon after it was published, then don't forget to enter for the giveaway for the Maxine core box that I'm doing right now. There's still a couple of days left. You can check out the video up here for how to enter. And don't forget that if you're a patron, you can actually get a second entry into the contest. Speaking of which, huge shout outs and special thanks to the extremely cool kids here on Patreon, the Steam Powered Scoundrels, Dogmatized, and Biclops Gladiator Games. And thanks for watching.